All right. Well, hopefully you've had a chance to download the notes for Unit 11. And hopefully you watched the Fallen video I posted on Moodle that covers a lot of the World War II deaths, both military and civilian, and give you an opportunity to try to grasp how many people died in the war. But now we're going to shift our focus to what happened after the war. And that's the Cold War. All right, so the Cold War is a term we use to describe the conflict between really America and the Soviet Union from 1945 to about 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So the Cold War includes military conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War. It includes the threat of atomic warfare, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and just an overall tension between the two greatest world powers after World War II, which were America and the USSR. So we're just going to be looking at selected topics involving the Cold War, including the Korean War, in this unit, and then at the end of the unit we'll look at the Civil Rights Movement. So it's really like the 1950s and early 60s is what the unit will cover. So the roots of the Cold War kind of start, or you could argue they start, at the Yalta Conference, February 1945. So World War II is still going on, and this is a meeting between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, as you see in the picture. Yalta was a place on the Black Sea in the Crimean Peninsula. So I put a picture there so you could see that on the part of the Ukraine. And one of the big issues that was discussed at the Yalta Conference is what to do with Poland. Poland, as you remember, in September of 1939 was divided between the Germans and the Russians. And both the Germans and the Russians killed thousands of Poles. And the argument was that FDR and Churchill wanted Poland to have free elections. The government of Poland actually was in exile in London. And if you watched the Fallen video closely, you saw that the Polish lost more people after the invasion of Germany and Russia than they did in the invasion itself, because they continued to fight the entire war. It was, whether it was working on the Enigma, like Marian Rejewski, or whether it was fighting in Italy, or parachuting in the Battle of Market Garden. The Poles were very active in fighting against the Germans. And also, as you learned in the Fallen video, that no other country lost a larger percentage of its people. Close to 20% of all Polish people died in World War II. That's civilian and military, about 6 million people. And yeah, compared to America, we lost over 400,000 in the war, but that was less than 1% of our population comparatively. So, all right, so Stalin, so Winston Churchill argued, never could I be content with any solution that would not leave Poland as a free and independent state. Stalin's promise to Churchill and FDR was that Poland would be free, independent, and powerful. But of course, that was completely empty. It was like Hitler's promise at the Munich conference that to Neville Chamberlain that once he had the Sudetenland, he wouldn't take any other land. I mean, it was just a big lie. And British diplomat said in 1945 after the Yalta Conference that there was just zero chance that Stalin would let Poland be free. Because the people of Russia weren't free, right? They were under the grip of communism. So part of the tragedy that was Poland was in 1944, this is a picture of Warsaw in 1945, but in 1944, in the city of Warsaw, so we looked at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, where the Jews tried to fight for their freedom before being slaughtered in the Holocaust. And in 1944, starting I think in August 1, 1944, so Warsaw is the capital city of Poland, and the Russians were getting close. And so the people of Warsaw wanted to revolt against the Germans and take control of the city so that the Russians couldn't force Warsaw and then Poland into communism after the war. And obviously, thousands of Poles were killed by the Russians in the Katyn massacre in 1939 or 1940. And the Russians and the Poles were at odds with one another because the Poles wanted there to be an investigation into the Russian war crimes against the Poles. And Stalin, of course, knew he was guilty of massacring thousands and wanted no part of that. So in 1944, the people of Warsaw revolted against the Germans, and they had their underground army, the Home Army, and they fought bravely for 63 days, trying to push the Germans out. And the Russians could have helped, but because they didn't want the Polish, they didn't want the people alive, really. Stalin wanted anyone who would be daring to resist his rule to die. So the Russian army just stayed outside of Warsaw and watched the fighting, basically, and did nothing. Additionally, the British and the Americans wanted to use Soviet airstrips to drop supplies into Warsaw to help them fight the Germans, and the Soviets refused to allow that to happen. So basically, they just watched the Germans' army regroup and destroy the people of Warsaw. By the time the uprising was done, like I said, 63 days later, over 15,000 men in the Polish Home Army were killed, and over 200,000 civilians. And the Germans, in retribution, leveled the city. They destroyed over 10,000 buildings. This was a very historic city, and they just decimated it. And by the time the Russians finally came in to liberate Warsaw, there was really nothing left. The people had been taken away, put in concentration camps, etc. So every year on August 1 at 5 p.m. In Warsaw, they play sirens, and there's a moment of silence. The entire city stops. The cars stop. The people stop. Everything stops. and they sit there for a minute to remember the brave Poles who died in the uprising. So there's really, in some ways, you could argue that there's no sadder nation in World War II than Poland. They fought the entire war. They lost the most people proportionately. They tragically lost control of their own country. They traded the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler for the communist rule of Joseph Stalin. And they would endure that for 40 some years. So really heartbreaking to consider Poland fighting the whole war for their freedom only to be given over to Stalin. And the Allies really did nothing to stop that. All right, so you see Poland here between the USSR and Western Europe. Letter B in your notes says the dividing and punishing of Germany. So Germany was divided between the United States, Great Britain, France, and Soviet Union. And so West Germany became the three West Germany was Britain, France, and America, and East Germany was controlled by the Soviets. Now you notice that Berlin itself is deep in the middle of East Germany, and Berlin was split into three parts. East Berlin was controlled by the Soviets, and West Berlin controlled by the United States, Britain, and France. So so that's how Germany was divided, and they were punished in that they were occupied, and of course their country was decimated by both the Russians and the Americans in World War II. What was worse was when the Soviet Union poured into Germany at the tail end of World War II. They were looking for revenge for what the Germans did at Leningrad in the forced starvation and just across the Russian countryside. And so there was, some people call this the rape of the Germans, because thousands of women were sexually abused by the Russian soldiers, and it was a horrific time in German history. Also, their industry, the Soviets, basically any industry that the Germans still had was stripped down and brought into Russia. And their scientists, their leading scientists, were smuggled out of the country, either by the Americans in Operation Paperclip, or some by the Soviets as well, because we were looking at their research into rockets. Like they had the V-2 rocket, and they had, looking at using jet fighters instead of the props. So a lot going on in Germany after the war. Well, the Soviet Union, it wasn't just Poland and East Germany. You can see the Soviet influence spread throughout all of Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were all taken as well. They just merged right into the USSR. And so you can see this massive communist takeover of Eastern Europe. The Ukraine, Yugoslavia was under Soviet control, but it was communist as well under Tito. So we call this Winston Churchill coined the phrase the Iron Curtain. An Iron Curtain has descended, blocking out Eastern Europe from Western Europe. So here's just a political cartoon of Joseph Stalin claiming as much as he could. The reason the Soviets said was to create a buffer zone so that Germany, which had attacked Russia twice, once in World War I and now in World War II, would have there'd be a buffer between them because the Soviets had lost so many people between the two world wars. But it was really a power grab by the communists. So this is from a speech Winston Churchill gave in 1946 in Missouri, that these Eastern European countries were not subject just to Soviet influence, but a control, a very high and increasing measure of control. So that's really one of the tragedies of World War II. We fought this war for years to free Europe from Hitler, and we were only halfway successful because half of Europe was free, but the other half fell to communism. And so those people were not free for another 45 years. All right, so that takes us to containment. So our president at the time was Harry S. Truman. So I got his picture here. And the Truman, part of the Truman philosophy was containment. We don't want the communism to spread. So we're not going to go fight a war. We're not going to start World War III against the Soviet Union. But we don't want communism to spread anywhere else. So we're going to use diplomacy, economics, and our military to stop the spread of communism. And this would happen right away during Truman's presidency. So threats of Soviet conquest in Greece and Turkey and the Truman Doctrine. So the Soviets were trying to push into the Middle East, in Iran, but also in Greece, trying to spread communism in Greece and Turkey. So in Turkey, the Soviets wanted control of the Dardanelles, which is the water route that connects the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So you can see the larger map back here. I know it's not very good quality, but basically the Soviets obviously had access to the Black Sea, like the Crimean Peninsula where Yalta is. And to get their trade goods, etc., to the Mediterranean, or just their military, they wanted control of the Dardanelles by Turkey. And so we supported Turkey here to keep them free from Soviet influence. And so we sent two of our ships, the USS Missouri, which is our battleship, remember, and then this new aircraft carrier, the Franklin D. Roosevelt, which I put a picture of down here, CV-42, I believe, to show the Soviets that we meant business. So the Truman Doctrine, I don't know if my face is blocking this, if you can read it, but it says, give aid to people who are fighting against oppressive communist governments. So our philosophy was, if you are being threatened by communism, we will help you. So we ended up giving like $400 million to support Greece and Turkey against the Soviet Union. So we put our money where our mouth was. So this man here, George Marshall, who was a general in World War II, became a Secretary of State for Truman, and the goal was to provide aid to help rebuild Europe. So the last question on page 1, how did America respond to war-torn Europe in an attempt to keep them from communism? We responded with what we called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan provided economic aid to rebuild countries like France to keep them from communism. We knew that Stalin would try to spread communism throughout Europe, and so our goal was, if we can rebuild societies, even if that was a big investment, it would get paid back because we would create trade opportunities, etc., when we were rebuilding these European economies. So the the political cartoon here, you've got the communist vulture bringing chaos. And here's the Dr. U.S. Congress rushing towards Western Europe to rehabilitate before communism could spread any farther than it already had. Well, Stalin had another trick up his sleeve. So we're top of page 2 here. In 1948, just a few years after the end of the war, the Soviet Union blocked off West Berlin to try to starve the people out. So if you look back here, so remember, Berlin is completely inside of East Germany, completely inside of East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets. And then inside the city of Berlin itself, there's a piece, West Berlin, that was controlled by the Allies. So completely, though, in Soviet territory. And so what we did for 11 months is, because we were blocked off and they were trying to starve the people out so that the Soviets could control all of Berlin, we kind of drew a line in the sand and said, you know, containment, we're not going to allow you to spread. We're not going to allow you to take over Berlin or any other part of Germany that's not yours already. And so for 11 months, we brought food, medicine, and coal, because this went all through the winter, to the people of Berlin. So there was like over 1 million people that needed help. And so we were dropping food, medicine, and coal for 11 months to supply the German Berliners so they didn't have to give in to the Soviets. By the end, we had dropped like 1.7 million tons of supplies. One of our pilots, who was an amazing man, last I knew he was still alive, he was like 98 years old, is Gail Halverson, nicknamed the Candy Bomber. So I posted a video clip on Moodle that you should definitely watch. I know in this time of COVID-19 problems, it's easy to think of things you can't do and be negative. But he was talking about, in this video clip, he talks about how these German kids who were deprived of so much during the Berlin blockade, how they were just, you know, smelling a gum wrapper. It's a pretty amazing story. Anyway, so he had the idea of dropping candy to these children who had nothing. And so he bought as much candy as he could, and he used handkerchiefs to make parachutes so the candy wouldn't fall super fast and knock the kids out or hurt them. And it's kind of a neat story. So you should definitely watch that, Gail Halverson, the Candy Bomber. So that's the positive note I'm going to end on. So we're jumping into the Cold War. And so we're going to have this 45-year conflict with the Soviet Union, and that's going to become more evident from a military perspective starting in 1950 in Korea. But we're going to talk about that tomorrow. So hopefully you learned something. You can always subscribe to my channel and watch all these videos again and again. Have a good day.